I didn't know this would be the last time I felt alive, not because I was dying, but because I was waking up. There is a kind of living that looks impressive from the outside. It has chandeliers and lacquered floors, a garden trimmed into obedient shapes, a car that answers to a name, and a table that rarely sees the same face twice. For 40 years I wore that life like armor. It fit me, it gleamed, and it kept most questions at bay. People called me by an honorific, and meant it. They said my name with the little lift of admiration reserved for those who keep the house and the accounts and the family myth intact. I learned, early, to measure myself by the size of the gatherings I hosted and the way guests lingered in my drawing room, pretending to be as interested in my stories as I was in their applause. I married Roberto when my hair still did what I wanted. He was not a hero, he was a negotiator, a man who smelled deals like others smell coffee. We built a life that looked like victory. We had a marriage made of schedules, contracts, and an exquisite skill at keeping trifles out of the light. Our children arrived one by one like planned additions to a ledger. Rogerio, steady, hungry for the same kind of ascendancy the house symbolized. Patricia, elegant and efficient, with a laugh that did not linger. And Caio, who arrived last and liked to bring his hands back home covered in chalk dust and classroom stories. For years I believed my role was to set the standard. I taught my children how to accept compliments and how to avoid awkwardness. I taught them that dignity is a currency. I taught them, without meaning to, that some people exist to be polished and others to be admired. At night, when the staff had gone home and the candles dwindled, I would run my fingers over the family chain that hung in the jewelry box and feel for a second like the keeper of everything that mattered. The chain was not valuable only because of gold. It was valuable because it was a trace, a proof, that we had been careful and smart and deserved what we had. And then Roberto signed the papers. He signed them with the same composed smile he had used to sell a property or buy a silence. The divorce was a formality, one he insisted would protect me. A settlement, the lawyer called it, discreet and generous. Maybe Roberto believed he was rescuing me from the spectacle of a public fight. Maybe he believed he was simply managing risk. I could have refused. I could have demanded a courtroom melodrama. Instead, I found myself agreeing to terms that made me hold my breath. They wrote into the agreement that my financial freedom would remain intact if I agreed to a performance. It sounds absurd when I say it now, like a plot from a bad soap opera. I agreed to pretend that I had been stripped bare. I would, for the purposes of the family and the neighborhood, relinquish status. The settlement guaranteed that no one would contest my claim. In exchange, I would play the role of an elderly woman who had lost everything, a kind of social experiment, the lawyer explained, to see how people behaved when the veneer peeled away. Roberto watched me consider it and smiled that thin smile that had once convinced me that practicalities were the truest kind of love. I will not dress this up. The plan was foolish, and arrogance wore it like a crown. I told myself I was protecting the family's dignity by exposing their charity, testing the soil to see who would tend it when it rained. I told myself it was important to know who loved for me and who loved for the facade. It was supposed to be a moment of revelation for everyone. It was, I believed, a final exam for my children and a lesson in humility for me to administer. The idea of a test is attractive because it promises clarity. But tests blur when the person administering them forgets what they are. I should have known better than to build a trap that would let me watch people squirm. There is moral space between asking a hard question and setting someone up to fail. I slid across that space without noticing. The first part of the plan was simple. I would disappear from our usual life for a while. I would stay in a small room, dress in thrift store clothes, hand back what I didn't need to show I meant business. I would move among my children and act like a woman who had been stripped of the privileges I had once used like a language. No phones, no callers, no quiet confidants. I bought a cheap suitcase and a coat I had never worn because it was ugly enough to be believable. The lawyer gave me an envelope and a bank address. then looked at me with that mild approval people offer when they believe someone is performing a service that will clean the air. I knew their faces well. I knew the way Rogerio's jaw would set when he felt encroached upon, how Patricia's eyes would flit for an exit, how Caio's shoulders would slope because his life had never fitted into the same polished mold. I had a script for what I might learn, scenes of loyalty, scenes of indifference, scenes that would tell me which of my children had been raised on substance rather than etiquette. If anyone deserved better than to be the subject of a test, it was Caio. He had chosen a life that made my teeth tighten, teaching instead of investing, compassion instead of advantage. He married Sita, who came from a house where there are no Persian rugs and where the tea is made too weak to be considered pretension. I had once dismissed them in front of guests. I had done it the way people who are afraid of simplicity do, with a smile and a question of taste. It is an irony I have not been able to swallow. I thought I could manufacture suffering to see who would rise. I forgot to ask whether I had the right to put suffering in other people's hands simply so I could watch. The first trial was Rogerio. I arrived at his building in a dress that folded to places my usual tailor would never have tolerated. The doorman looked at me with the same professional detachment he would show a delivery. Marble floors swallowed the click of my 2 cheap heels, and the lobby smelled of linoleum and expensive cologne. Rogerio met me with a nod that was almost a bow. He was thinner than he had been in my memory, or maybe he had only shrunk in the face of the test. His apartment was a shrine of minimalism, abstract art, a sofa that cost more than my first car, a kitchen where not a single pot told a story. "I didn't expect you," Rogerio said, and I could hear a careful distance in his voice. He led me to a small table and offered water because he knew that was what the new script asked for, a performance of compassion without intimacy. When he left the room for a moment, a woman, his assistant perhaps, returned with an envelope. She said it was from him. Inside were 500 reais, folded in a way that looked practiced. 500 reais is enough for a modest meal in a modest neighborhood. It is a gesture that says, "I acknowledge you. Do not ask me more than this." Rogerio placed it on the table like an official notice. I remember the weight of that envelope in my hand, as if it were a stone. It had a sound of judgment. The moment stretched, and I felt something shift under my ribs. A small, vicious part of me wanted to collect the money and turn it into data, proof of my children's priorities. Another part wanted to laugh, to drop the envelope like a paper plane and watch it drift. But the envelope was a mirror. It showed me my own face in a way mirrors seldom do. Not the face perfected by salon lights, but the one that had been quietly corroded by assumptions. Rogerio talked about taxes and investments and the problem of inheritance law. His words were polite instruments, designed to keep things businesslike. He had not owned the life I had given him. He had inherited the technique of looking at people through the lens of usefulness. When he kissed me on the cheek, it was with the same gentleness one shows an old portrait. Affectionate, but slightly removed. I left his apartment with the envelope in my bag and the taste of antiseptic in my mouth. The elevator hummed like a confession booth. Patricia received me with the same practiced kindness, wrapped in better fabric and colder patience. Her car idled at the curb, leather seats gleaming like prepared statements. She took me only as far as the curb, as if closeness might smudge the perfection she had bought for her life. "I can't, Mom," she said when I reached for something more, an embrace or a plan. "I have a meeting." She slid a small bill across to me as if it were a receipt. "For groceries," she said. The corner of her mouth tightened, not into a smile, but into a line that would later trace the boundary between us. Her rejection was not cruel. It was functional. It taught me nothing about cruelty and everything about calculation. I will not pretend I wasn't wounded. But the sharpest pang was not the sting of these rejections. It was the sudden, corrosive clarity. I had built a life in which I rewarded those who polished the edges and kept those who dolled up the image. I had been training my children to be efficient in preserving what I prized, not to be wild and messy with affection. The soft CTA I had rehearsed in my head, The line you put into a story to remind an audience they are not alone seemed suddenly unnecessary and somehow trivial. Still, because life obliges format, I will say it now. If you have ever felt the floor fall away under your feet when a loved one chose comfort over care, stay with me a while. This story is not only about names, it is about what we value when the music stops. The trials with Rogerio and Patricia left a residue of a shame I could not scrub off. I walked through the city pretending to be invisible. People glanced at the coat and assumed certain things. Sitting on a bench, eating a pastry purchased with one of the small bills, I watched a mother with a toddler laugh in a way that felt like a private spring. I envied her ease. At the same time, there was that old woman inside me who wanted the test to succeed, who wanted either proof of loyalty or the comfort of righteous hurt. I had not realized I could hunger for both. Cayo's neighborhood came later in the day, like a different climate. The avenue narrowed into streets that knew the rhythm of a slower clock. There were small grocery stores where the proprietors left their boots outside and waved to customers by the names of their children. The houses were close to the street. Laundry lines stretched like flags. I had not been here often when my life was loud with appointments. I had considered it, politely, as a place of choices I did not approve of. There is a humility to walking into a neighborhood that smells of simmering onions and a neighbor's radio. It pricks a pride you didn't know you had. Cayo met me at the gate. He had not changed as dramatically as the city or the houses. He had always been gentle in the way people who are used to being imperfectly known are. His arms held me the way arms held a child who has come back with a surprise. "Mom," he said, and it was my name without a ledger attached. The house behind him was low and painted in the kind of color that suggested it had never needed a decorator's approval. A cat threaded between our legs and headed straight for the kitchen. Sita opened the door with flour on her hands. She had the hands of someone who made bread because it was necessary to make love stretch, quick, capable, the kind of hands that know how to mend. She wore no jewelry except a thin chain at her throat, a family brassiness that glinted when she moved. Her face was round and honest. She looked at me not as an exhibit, but as a person who might be hungry. That simple assumption that I might be hungry and needed to be fed disarmed me more than any courtesies from marble halls had ever done. "Come in, Senora," she said, slipping a towel into my lap, as if a hostess's instinct guided her. She placed a saucer of coffee in front of me that smelled of roast and home, not of labels. The cup held hands of warmth straight into my chest. She sat me down as if I were the most ordinary inconvenience and the most special thing she could offer. The house was not tidy in the way my drawing room pretended to be. It had a table scarred by many meals and a chair for every child that had ever visited. A small radio buzzed in the corner with a soap opera I didn't understand. There was a calm here that was not an absence of urgency, but a different kind of urgency. A daily insistence on making enough for tomorrow and feeding what you have today. Sita moved around the kitchen with an economy of motion that suggested 1,000 small economies were practiced here, not out of greed, but out of love. She took the best piece of meat, the prettier, nicer cut, and slid it onto my plate without announcing the action. "You get this," she said simply. The act was not a performance, it was an instinctive preference. Give the best to the guest who needs it most. I remember the first time I bit into that meat. It was hot and seasoned in a way my house's chef had never attempted. Salt balanced with something that could have been hope. The taste knocked something loose inside me. I swallowed not only food, but an admission that I had been starved in an interior way, despite the cupboards of trophies my life had stocked. Something in me that had been deadened by years of polishing stirred. We ate like people who do not have a staff to clear the plates right away. Conversation slipped from one small thing to another. The price of eggs, a child's math test, a neighbor's goat that had eaten a newspaper. Cayo told a silly story, his voice folding like a familiar blanket. Sita laughed at its edges and then at the middle. I laughed too, though my laughter had a different texture now. not because of the food, but because someone in that room treated me as if waiting tables were the same kind of dignity as keeping a corporation. There was an intimacy in that meal that I had never learned how to manufacture in the grand dining rooms of my past. It did not rely on candlelight or orchestration. It relied on hands and warmth and the uncomplicated arithmetic of feeding a person with the best you have that day. At one point, Sita reached across the table and brushed something from my sleeve, a smudge of sauce that had splashed when I had picked up my fork. The movement was so ordinary it should have been invisible. Instead, it registered like a small, bright bell that could not be ignored. Later, when the light was slanting and the radio had changed programs, I sat in a chair that had a cushion sewn with uneven stitchings and listened to the house. I had expected this part of my test to be easy. A quick visit, a measure taken, a data point recorded. Instead, I found myself uncoiling. The walls did not ask me to perform. They simply reflected a life that had been lived, if not in splendor, then in substance. Night crept in with a softness I had not felt in a long time. The neighbors said a polite good evening through the fence. A dog began to snore under a table. Kaio called me by a nickname I did not remember having, and in his voice was the kind patience of someone who believes people can always return to a better version of themselves. There was a small room made ready for me, as if the house expected guests, and always had a spare bed. The bed was neat, sheets clean, a blanket folded at the foot. The lamp on the bedside table threw a circle of light that felt like a sanctuary. I lay down and thought of the envelope from Rogerio, the toast from Patricia, and the warm plate from Sita. The ledger in my mind refused to balance. I had walked into 3 different households and found 3 different currencies of affection. I should have slept. Instead, I listened. I could hear voices in the kitchen, muffled by a door. Kaio discussing school repairs, Sita answering softly. There was a tenderness in their conversation that sounded as if it had been practiced mostly in the small hours, how to stretch the week's budget, whose shoe needed fixing. It was not dramatic. It had none of the polished arcana of my old life. It had the matte, stubborn patience of people who cared by doing the small things they could do. And then I heard Sita say, without any dramatics, "If it comes to it, I can sell my mother's chain." The words landed like a fist. They were offered as a practical solution, not as a sacrifice to be applauded. She spoke of the chain as if it were a resource the way a pantry is a resource, to be used if it helps someone you love eat. I heard the metal clasp slide between fingers in the next room. I heard the sound of a chain being unclasped, a tiny metallic confession that echoed in my chest. I had never known the exact weight of that chain in her life. To me, a chain was an accessory, a family heirloom in a box. To her, it was a tangible measure of someone's past and a possible currency for a present need. The thought of her considering it to cover something as mundane and terrifying as medicine, I do not say it lightly, pushed a tide of shame so high I could have drowned in it. I lay there with the lamp's orange light painting half my face and listened to the soft sound of metal against skin. My plan had been to see who loved me when the suits were gone, who would stitch the rent of me without a label. I had turned poverty into a performance, and a woman who had never sought the spotlight was now ready to pawn the one sentimental thing she possessed to help a stranger she believed to be poor. Something in me broke. It didn't shatter with the melodrama of the movies. It cracked quietly, an internal seam opening to something I had not allowed myself to feel. The realization that my experiment had cost someone possible pain. I thought, with a sudden, electric shame, of all the times I had believed my tests were educational and not injurious. I thought of my children's faces, not as characters in a ledger, but as humans who might be wounded by my curiosity. I remembered the lawyer's envelope in my purse, the settlement, the guarantee that no one would challenge my claim. I remembered Roberto's composed hand as he had signed, as if signing was a way to tie up loose moral threads with a neat bow. The contrast between the two images was too sharp. On one side, the luxury of secured assets. On the other, a woman holding the chain that might be her mother's last tangible memory. I sat up. The lamplight seemed suddenly too bright. If I had wanted a clean rehearsal of moral truths, I could have arranged one without letting human hearts get bruised. But life is rarely willing to be neatly staged. The chain in Saida's hand, the quiet determination in her voice, revealed the cruelty of my own experiment. I had turned moral inquiry into theater and other people into props. A new motion took me then, urgent and simple. I walked to the door that separated my room from the kitchen. The floorboards protested, the old house announcing a footstep. I opened the door, and there, at the table, Saida held the small chain like a rosary. Her eyes were directed at it as if it were an object that had belonged to someone who deserved reverence and also to someone who could be a checkbook in times of trouble. She looked up when I entered. For a beat she seemed uncertain, then she smiled as if she'd been expecting me. "You didn't sleep?" she asked. "No," I said. My voice surprised me with its earnestness. There were no ironies left in it. "I couldn't." She rose and put the chain into my hand, like you might hand over a basket without asking for thanks. "It could help," she said. "It could be enough for what you need." I felt the metal cold under my fingers. It was lighter than I had imagined. It carried a story I did not know, and all at once the story was not about who had the bigger house, but about who would lay down what they had for someone else. I did not know then what I would do next. I could stop her, admit my wrongs, reveal the truth, and stop the sale. Or I could remain the architect of a lesson that was now teaching others pain. In that suspended moment, the plan I had thought was clever looked like a child's game with stakes I had not designed. The house breathed around us. A pot boiled softly on the stove. Minutes stretched and condensed until time had the density of truth. My hands tightened around the chain. I smelled lemon and garlic. I heard the gentle scrape of Sita's spoon. The chain glinted and seemed to ask one question with unembellished insistence. Who saves whom when the masks fall off? My throat closed on the correct moral answers I once would have rehearsed like speeches at a salon. This was not a salon. It was a kitchen. The choices here were not for audiences. They were for living people making the small, real transactions that love requires. I had come to see what my children would do without wealth as a filter. Instead, I found someone willing to sell a memory of her mother to ensure another woman could keep a sliver of health. I stood there with the chain in my hand and felt the old life sliding from my fingers and something else beginning to rise. It was not a triumphant feeling. It was a raw, urgent recognition that I had been bankrupt in a way the bank could not measure, and that a woman I had dismissed for simplicity possessed a currency I had never learned to spend. I did not yet speak about the envelope from the lawyer. I did not yet reveal the settlement that guaranteed I had more than enough. The knowledge of my wealth was a dry fact in my purse. The sight of Sita's chain in my hand was a living thing that demanded a response beyond ledger entries. At that moment, standing in a humble kitchen with a necklace between my fingers, I felt something like a birth that came too late to undo old mistakes but early enough to start healing. The feeling was not a fireworks display. It was a small, steady flame, the kind that can warm a room if you commit to feeding it. I think, even then, I did not completely understand the depth of the change. I knew only that the story I had come to watch had turned on me. The people I intended to test had become teachers. The house I had once judged shallow was sheltering a truth I had been avoiding my whole life. That life is lived in hands and in plates, not in rooms and reputation. I sat down opposite Sita. The chain lay between us like an accusation and an offering. I remembered, with a sudden clarity, all the times I had thought I was teaching my children the right lessons. That belief now felt arrogant and cruel. If the test had a moral at all, it was not the tidy one I had drafted. It was a more radical, tender thing. Humility is not a lesson you give to others. It is the state you step into when you finally recognize your own poverty. The night outside pressed gently against the windows. Inside, a lamp made a small island of light on the table. I folded my hands around the chain, feeling its coldness warming under my palms. Somewhere down the street, a radio played a song I did not know the words to, and yet the melody seemed to belong to the kind of life I had been missing. I had not intended, when I left the marble halls, to be undone by a plate of food and the clinking of a necklace. But the deepest truths often arrive dressed in the smallest gestures. I sat there, and for the first time in many years, listened rather than arranged. The feeling was dizzying and strange, and above all, alive. But not the kind of being I had mistaken for life for so long. This would be the last time I felt alive in the old way, I realized. The thrilling, hollow life of performance and polish. What was arriving was quieter, and I did not yet know its name. I lifted my head and looked at Caio, who had come into the doorway with shoes on his feet and a tired smile. He watched me without the scrutiny of the boardroom. There was a softness in his eyes that made whatever I was about to do weigh heavier than any contract. Behind him, Saida waited, the chain resting now in her lap like a thing surrendered for love. The test had become a reckoning. The ledger in my purse and the ledger in my heart were no longer the same. I held the chain as if it might speak, but it had nothing to say that morning. It was a witness only to what was real in that moment. A decision about who we were to each other when pretenses fell. I had entered Caio's house to collect a data point. What I found instead was a future that required me to choose whom I would be in it. I could keep the lie and let Saida's chain vanish into a pawnshop drawer to pay for the performance I had staged. Or I could stop the sale, admit my fraud, and begin to put my resources where my heart, newly woken, knew they ought to be. Outside, the night thickened. Inside, the air hummed. The chain lay in my palm. My thoughts scattered like papers in a sudden wind. I understood now that the life I had curated had been a museum. Things to be looked at, admired, but ultimately separate from the messy, nourishing work of living with people who make real sacrifices for each other. I did not yet speak the words that would undo the plan, but I felt the shape of them forming like a compass needle, turning toward a true north I had only just discovered. I stood there, with the chain in my hand, until my fingers remembered how to let go of something that wasn't mine to keep. The hush in that little kitchen felt like a summons. I could feel Caio's eyes on me, not counting or weighing, just holding. Saida's hands, flour-dusted and honest, rested on the table. The necklace, cool and simple, lay like a question between us. "I made a mistake," I said finally, and the words surprised me by being small and true instead of theatrical. They scratched at the varnish of all the rehearsed speeches I had once kept in tidy rows. I did not have the right to this. I gestured to the chain and then to everything else the plan had touched. The tests, the envelopes, the absence of my usual callers. I thought I could learn what it meant to be loved by setting this up. I am sorry. Saida's face softened, not with triumph, but with that slow compassion that belongs to people who know debts differently, not as ledgers, but as obligations of the heart. "You don't have to be sorry, Senora," she said. "You can stop it." I laughed then, a sound without pride. It was absurd that it had taken so long for me to understand that stopping was not the cowardice I had imagined it to be. Stopping was the only brave thing left. "You're right," I said. "I will stop it." I could have staged a grand explanation, a confession set to dramatic lighting. Instead, I reached into my purse, felt the stiff paper of the lawyer's envelope where it had been pressed into secrecy, and slid it across the table. "This is the settlement Roberto provided," I said. "I have money, more than enough. I will not let you sell this chain." Saida's hands trembled when she touched the envelope, as if she could not at once accept that an object she had considered for the pawnshop might be spared. Caio stood there with the helpless look of a man who had come to terms with being poor in appearance, but rich in love. He wrapped his arms around me then, briefly, and it felt like a welcome back from the edge of something I had spent decades building to avoid. "Take it," I told them both. "No, listen. I will not let you use your things because I asked you to test my children. That was cruel. If anything is being redistributed, it should be because you chose each other, not because I manufactured suffering." Sita blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean I will take care of any expenses your family needs. I will, not in a way that takes your dignity, but in a way that recognizes what you already do. The chain stays." I put my palm over the small metal loop and felt suddenly protective of it in a way that surprised me. "And I will make sure you are provided for. The money I have, it's mine to direct. I am going to put it where there is kindness, not where there is vanity." For a moment, Sita's face registered incredulity, then a cautious, disbelieving gratitude. "But why would you—" "Because you didn't make me perform to see if I was lovable," I said. "You treated me like a person. That matters more than you know." We talked long into the night in the slant of lamplight, not as players in a moral theater, but as people trying to set the crooked boards of a common life straight. I refused to let them sell the chain. I refused to let the experiment continue. I told them the whole thing. The settlement, the lawyer's instructions, my ridiculous plan. I said it without the theatrical flourish I once thought necessary. I said it with a certain clean embarrassment that comes when someone you have underestimated is generous enough to forgive. Sita listened without anger. Caio, quiet as a man who has been taught to listen by children, asked practical questions about what we would do next. He didn't ask for a lecture. He asked, "What do you want, Mom? What will you do?" I had not known the answer until that moment. I had expected, had rehearsed, a satisfaction in having been proved right or wrong. Instead, what rose like a new tide was a desire to be near, to fix a leaking roof, to sit at a table that meant something, to be needed in the way a person can be needed without applause. "I want to come live with you," I said. They looked at me, as if I had suggested moving into a punchline. Caio smiled then, not a smile of triumph, but of someone accepting a gift. "Yes, we have a small bedroom," he said. "There's always room." I could have returned to the marble halls the next morning, made a spectacle of repentance with chandeliers and an audience. Instead, I signed a paper in Sita's kitchen. Nothing legal because it didn't need to be. It was simply a promise laid on a table between human beings. I promised not to create pain again with my curiosity. I promised to share what I had in ways that honored the people who had been there when I pretended otherwise. We did not call a lawyer to notarize tender words. We simply ate breakfast the next day together. Word, of course, moves. Family connections are not made of stone. They are like the telephone wires that run across Caio's neighborhood. Old, humming, sometimes frayed. Rogerio found out because someone took pity on me and called to ask if I was all right. Patricia learned because she could not help herself. There was a particular kind of curiosity she had cultivated that thrived on small catastrophes. By noon, my absence from the grand house and my presence in a small one was the subject of 100 thin conversations. They came to see me. I had not arranged a theater for the reveal. I simply sat at the table with Caio and Sita and 2 plates of steaming beans between us. The doorbell rang, and I felt the familiar flicker of nerves that belonged to the woman who had once believed in appearances. When I opened the door, Rogerio stood there with his coat buttoned against a rain that had started to make the street smell like dust and wet cement. He looked older than I had remembered, worn in the expression where someone calculates and is exhausted by his own calculations. "Mom," he said. The word was a statement that attempted warmth and found something else. He stepped into the kitchen as if he were stepping into an exhibit. He saw the table and the low ceiling, and I watched the way his shoulders shortened in the tiny space like a man adjusting his posture. Patricia came minutes later. She had the practiced look of someone arriving late to a meeting and regretting time wasted. They didn't ask for an explanation. They assumed there would be one. Rogerio spoke first. This is a stunt," he said, sharper than the rain. This is another one of your performances. You forced us into a spectacle. I felt the old costume tug at me, the armor of speech I had worn when defending decisions, but the newness in me refused to put it on. No, I said quietly, this is not a performance. Patricia's expression hardened. So you staged your own downfall? To see who would do what? I interrupted. Yes, I did something awful to understand a deeper thing. I am not proud, but I'm not here to perform. I'm here to tell you that I stopped it. And because I stopped it, I have to choose how to fix what I broke. They both stared at the table like it had turned into evidence. For a second, I saw their youth again, the small boys and girls who had tucked their shirts in and listened to lessons about airs and decorum. How we prize order above surprise. Rogerio's voice had the edge of wounded entitlement. And you wasted everyone's time? You came here to watch us squirm? To hurt us? You were hurt, I said. Yes, I know that. I apologize. I am not asking forgiveness because I deserve it. I am asking for the chance to make restitution. Patricia snorted. And how will you do that? By moving in with the people you once said did not belong in our world? Yes, I said. By moving in with them, by supporting them, by changing what I leave behind. I have money, and it will go to people who showed generosity, not to those who kept a ledger of appearances. They bristled, as expected. But I wanted no triumphant gloating. The new thing in me did not seek victory over their rashness. It sought repair. I am not here to punish you, I said. I am here to tell you I was wrong and to show that I can be different. Rogerio looked as if I had handed him a mirror he did not want to look into. Different how? You think moving to Caio's house will fix the past? No, I said, but it might fix a future. I will reassign my estate, not because I am vengeful, but because I want to recognize who loved me in truth. He laughed, a brittle sound. So you disinherit us? Publicly? For a kitchen and a plate of beans? I will not make this about punishment, I said. I will make it about love's accounting. If you want your inheritance, earn it with something more than polite affections. If you want to keep your relationships, start by showing them. I am choosing people who made sacrifices, who would have given from a narrow pantry. It is my decision. The silence that followed was not the sound of thunder, but the slow cracking of old ice. Patricia, who had been taught to measure life in returns and appearances, looked as if all the catalogued images she had stored of me and our household were being taken off a shelf and dusted in bright, embarrassing light. They left that day without violence. They left with the dignity of people who assume time will eventually place them back where they thought they belonged. I did not chase them. I did not call lawyers to pin down a contract meant to hurt. I simply sat at the table and watched Caio fill our cups with coffee. The decision had been made, not with the finality of law at first, but with the weight of intention. The next weeks were messy in the way life is when things shift. I wrote to my lawyer and arranged to revise my will. I asked him to draft the documents that would place property and certain accounts into trusts for those who had been willing to make sacrifices for love instead of for image. I did it humbly and openly. There was no satisfaction in making someone else small through legal means. The change was not to gloat, but to align my resources with my new values. Rogerio and Patricia contested me in quiet ways. Texts that were sharp, a son blustering that I had been manipulated, a daughter suggesting I was losing my mind. They called old friends and spoke in the voice of people who had always relied on networks of influence. They hurt and they lashed out. That did not surprise me. What surprised me was how much of my own sorrow was tied to their pain. My repentance was not cunning triumph. It was honest mourning for what our family had lost in exchange for a kind of social polish. Outside of those bruised conversations, life began to take the shape of small, real commitments. I moved my things into a spare room that belonged to Caio and Sita. It was simply furnished. A bed, an old dresser with drawers that stuck, a window that looked out onto a street where children played with makeshift kites. The neighborhood's rhythm entered me like a new language. Early mornings carried the smell of frying onions and bread rising in ovens. The neighbors nodded as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world that an older woman with a life in ballrooms now wanted to learn how to mend a gate. There were rituals I had never practiced. I learned to sweep the front step without a flinty critic's eye. I learned to make beans in a pot that didn't have a timer to announce its readiness. I bought a second-hand radio and argued with Caio over a soap opera I couldn't follow but liked because it made the house feel inhabited. There were afternoons when I volunteered to help at the school where Caio taught. The children called me together in a language that had no translation. They expected me to bring treats, but also to listen. I sat in a classroom and found that being asked to read an awkward paragraph aloud was both humiliating and unexpectedly necessary. The applause of children, unpolished and enthusiastic, felt like the sound of being useful for a reason other than curation. One afternoon, months after the kitchen night with the chain, a neighbor's grandchildren ran into our yard with ice cream mustaches and stories of scraped knees. I tucked a blanket around the littlest one and listened to him complain about the teacher he thought unfair. Caio watched me and laughed softly. "You fit in here," he said. It occurred to me then that fitting in wasn't about matching furniture or taste. It was about being counted in the daily ledger of lives. There was, I discovered, a richness to being the person who remembered birthdays and who brought hot chocolate to a child on a rainy afternoon. It was not the glamour I had once sold myself on, but it was a form of life that made sense at the deepest level. Financial arrangements took shape formally, of course. The lawyer, professional, dry, and now a different sort of companion to my life, helped me put in place trusts and transfers that matched my intents. I set up funds for Caio and Sita's house repairs. I established a modest education fund for the children in the neighborhood. I arranged for a small monthly stipend for the elderly neighbors who had no roof close to being fixed. I insisted, sometimes gently, sometimes with stubbornness that had not yet left me, that money be given in a way that preserved dignity. That meant sometimes paying invoices directly, sometimes offering work for local tradespeople so they would not feel charity's sting. Word of these changes traveled in a different register than gossip. People told stories of an older woman who had moved into a modest house and who spent mornings knitting and afternoons visiting the school's library. They told these stories with small shakes of their heads, as if to say that people could still surprise them. Rogerio and Patricia, for their part, slowly recalibrated. There were awkward reconstructions hours when they tried to reach me with conciliatory gestures, invitations that smelled of compromise, calls that attempted to recreate the language of our old life. I answered some and declined others, always leaning toward what felt honest rather than comfortable. There were moments of real reconciliation. Rogerio once brought his son to visit. He came with an apology that was not eloquent, but was honest, words picked over and ironed in the rawness of fatherhood. "We were wrong," he admitted, the sentence like an offering. "I am sorry." I held his small boy in my lap and thought of the ledger again, the old one that measured people as columns of worth. "It's not about being right or wrong," I said. "It's about what we do now." He looked at me as if seeing me newly. "Do you hate us?" I was honest. "No, I used to love the idea of us. I love the image. I'm learning how to love you, genuine and messy. It's different." Patricia called months later, with fewer words and more small details of life. Her voice had matured in a way that made me realize reconciliation does not always show up as dramatic gestures. Sometimes it arrives in a text with advice on which brand of flour to buy that doesn't clump in humidity. She offered quietly to help me catalog old letters from my mother that I had kept in a tin box. It wasn't a grand reconciliation scene. It was the gradual, domestic resumption of intimacy. But the deepest change was in myself. I had been an entrepreneur of image for decades, producing narratives for guests and for the neighborhood who watched our sound and lights. Now I had to learn to be small and to let my life be measured in meals and mornings rather than ceremonies. At first, that felt like loss. Then I discovered it was a different kind of gain. There is a pleasure to learning the names of people who live next door, to remembering that the woman down the street grows basil in a tin can and offers it to neighbors without preamble. There is a kind of fellowship in unpretentious exchanges that no chandelier can buy. The decision to reassign my wealth did not make me omniscient. There were mistakes. I wrote checks that were stolen by bad advice. I trusted a man with two smooth hands who promised to fix a roof and disappeared. The money I sent sometimes attracted attention I had not wanted. But there was also the joy of watching a shaky wall become a solid back porch, of seeing Sita's small garden produce tomatoes that outgrew expectation, of watching Caio come home tired and fold completely into a couch as if it were a small harbor. One of the most telling days came in late summer. The radio on the kitchen table played an old song that I used to hum under my breath at the stove in the mansion. I was sitting with a bowl of soup Sita had made, bean broth with a bite of coriander, and I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Rogerio. He had come with his son again, who had drawn a crooked picture and wanted me to put it on the refrigerator we had purchased together, old hospitality becoming new. "You look different," Rogerio said. "Not tired in the same way." "I sleep better," I said, "when someone needs my hands in a way that isn't just for show." He looked at me for a long while as if trying to tally what this meant. "You missed so much," he said. "Dad's been attending auctions instead of dinners." I did not scold him. I only answered with what was true. "We all miss things, Rogerio, but we can still be present." There were surprises beyond my imagination. The gardener from my old house, quiet, efficient, with hands the color of the earth, visited me one afternoon. He had retired, he said, and wanted to give me the cuttings from a plant we used to have in the mansion. He placed them on my bedside table like a small offering of continuity. The staff who had once worked in our home wrote letters I read late at night, and in them they told me stories that contained my life in ways I had never allowed. They did not need my vanity to feel true. They wanted the dignity of being seen. And there was the matter of the necklace. It never left the house. Sida kept it wound in a small box on a shelf above the kitchen sink, where the light hit it sometimes, like a small private star. She refused to let me lock it away in a bank vault. "It's yours," she told me once. "Keep it where you can look at it when you want to remember." I kept it there. Each time my fingers brushed the chain, I thought of that night. The hush, the radio, the smell of fried onions, the small metal threads between my fingers. The necklace had become less an object and more a witness to the moment I recognized my own poverty and to the slow, awkward way I had tried to spend what I had learned. People still asked me from time to time if I regretted the life I had lost, the chairs, the parties, the gilded names. I did not answer them with a neat moral. Instead, I thought of a late afternoon in which a child had come running to the garden, breathless with excitement over a beetle. I had dropped everything and crouched to look, as if the creature were a king. The child had laughed, delighted by my sudden willingness to be small. That laughter, I had discovered, mattered more to me than any bouquet of praise. There were quiet days when old habits whispered at the edges. Vanity is a stubborn weed. Sometimes I would glance at my reflection and notice the woman who once measured rooms with an unblinking eye. But those moments were smaller, more manageable. The things that once filled my days had new shapes. I learned the difference between being alive for an audience and being alive for a life. And then there was the day an old friend from the main mansion came to visit. She had come not for gossip, but because she had heard a different rumor, that the woman who had been the grand matriarch now made lentils in a pot and gave them away. We sat on the stoop, and she took my hand in both of hers. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Sometimes," I admitted. "The parts that were beautiful, I miss. But the life that made me feel alive did not belong to the chandeliers. It belonged to the small, true things I now have." She looked at me for a long time, then said, You taught people how to function in a world you are now leaving. Yes, I said, and that is perhaps my greatest failing. I taught my children to value the presentation more than the bread, but I am learning the opposite. We laughed together, a sound that had no malice. It felt good to be accepted even as I confessed the uglier parts of myself. Confession, I found, was not a door to punishment, but a path to reorientation. Months folded into a year. There were still hard conversations with my older children. Some were irreversible. Time has a way of reconfiguring relationships that are tested by betrayal. Reconciliation does not always follow a neat arc. It can be slow, it can be partial, and sometimes it never comes. But living near Caio and Sita, seeing the way they loved their neighbors, teaching in a school where children's faces brightened when they entered, rebuilding small things in a house with hands I could trust, these daily realities became my measure. I began to understand what the title had meant. To me, and perhaps to anyone who must reorient after a long habit of living for the visible. The night I held the chain in my hand and felt the metal cool against my palm was the last time I felt alive in the old way, the way that had been sustained by applause and the hum of an elegant air conditioning system. The feeling had been thrilling in its own way, the quickened pulse at a successful social maneuver, the satisfaction of being admired. But it was false life, a counterfeit that skimmed the surface without feeding anything essential. What came after that small, shattering moment was a quieter, truer aliveness. It did not announce itself with fireworks. It arrived as a series of courtesy notes to myself. I will show up. I will feed someone. I will listen. I will apologize when I'm wrong. I will withhold judgment and offer help. Each of these acts did not create spectacle. They created a life that I could feel deep in my chest. That feeling was steadier and more nourishing than any compliment. Sometimes, late at night, I sit by the window that looks over the street and watch the neighborhood go on. A boy plays soccer in an alley, a woman hangs laundry, someone listens to a radio. I am no longer the person whose identity was bound up in curtains and crystal. I am an older woman who has learned to be accounted for by love and service, rather than by display. In those moments, I feel alive in a way that is both humble and profound. It is a life that asks of me a constant awkwardness, the willingness to be vulnerable, to be small, to be corrected. People ask me what I would have done differently if I could step back in time and change just one thing. I think of the particular sharpness of regret, how comfortable arrogance can feel, and I would say this: I would not have made people into experiments. I would have invited them into truth instead of staging their failings for a truer revelation. Tests can teach, but when the test is your own vanity, it becomes cruelty. If I could do anything again, I would choose to cultivate authenticity over spectacle from the beginning. And yet, I cannot ignore the way that mistake opened a door. It taught me, painfully, what and who mattered. The lesson cost someone nearly a chain, but it also allowed me to stumble toward repair. I do not mean to rationalize my cruelty. I simply state a fact. Sometimes we break to become honest. I wish we could learn this without hurting others, but we do not get to choose that part. We only get to choose how we respond when the truth surfaces. In the end, the last time I felt alive in the old way was not a tragic coda, but a hinge. It swung open to reveal a life I had never planned for, small, communal, attentive. It offered no glamour, but it brought me closer to the people who would actually stand by me in times that mattered. Caio and Sita, with their stubborn, generous hands, did not calculate my value. They only showed up. That is what changed me. Before I leave this story, there are things I want you to carry with you. Not prescriptions or neat moral formulas, just a few honest words. First, it is possible to mistake admiration for life. It feels alive because it quickens the pulse, but it feeds only the ego. Second, humility does not mean absence of dignity. Often, dignity is found in the small sacrifices people make every day. Third, if you are tempted to set people up as tests, don't. Tests can break trust, and trust, once broken, is not always repairable. If you want to know who loves you, invite openness and be prepared to accept what you find. My life now is quieter, and sometimes I still miss the thrill of being admired. But the quiet has its own music. It's the sound of a kettle being set on a stove, the creak of a street gate, the laughter of a child who thinks you are the only person who knows how to make a proper sandwich. I have a new kind of calendar filled with soup recipes and library visits, and nights when I listen to Caio recount the day at school. There is work to be done, mending fences, mending hearts, and sometimes mending my own old proclivities. I am no saint. I am simply a woman who was given a startling second chance to be humane. If you are sitting where I once sat, surrounded by beautiful things that make you feel visible but not known, consider asking a different question, not who admires me, but who will hold a bowl for me when I am shaking. Not who will applaud my table, but who will come when the music stops. Those answers are sometimes messy, sometimes disappointing, but they will teach you what truly sustains a life. I didn't know, when I walked into Caio's kitchen with an ugly coat and a cheap suitcase, that I would find the last alive thrill of my old life there. I didn't know that admission would be the hinge to a truer, quieter being. But I did learn this. Life worth living is rarely showy. It is usually small and stubborn. It is composed of hundreds of tiny decisions to feed, to forgive, to stay. That is where I found my breath again. Not the breath of being admired, but the breath of belonging. Now I want to ask you something gently. If you lost everything tomorrow, if the chandelier dimmed and the letters stopped, who would stand with you and make you a bowl of soup? Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and who you think would stay. I read every story, and I believe the place where we feel warmth is the place worth fighting for.